This is Building Tomorrow, the Society of Construction Law Australia podcast.
On the show, you'll hear real conversations about what matters most to the people behind the scenes who are shaping Australian construction.
From lawyers and contract administrators to engineers, commercial managers, consultants, and all the other experts forging the future of Australian infrastructure today. I'm Mawona Matanda.
I'm BJ Lamsal.
And I'm Jennifer Raphael. This episode is part of a special 3-part series exploring culture in the construction industry, including mental health, diversity, leadership, and the future of workforce sustainability across the sector. Today we're chatting with Michelle Turner. Michelle is a professor at RMIT University in Australia. Prior to joining academia, Michelle worked as a project professional across various industries and completed a Master of Project Management. Alongside her teaching, Michelle conducts research on student resilience and wellbeing, women in construction, and construction workers' health and wellbeing. Her work has been published in top construction management and education journals. She has co-authored a book on health and wellbeing in the construction industry and presented at international conferences. In this episode, Michelle will discuss her role as part of the Culture in Construction Taskforce. We will dive into the challenges around women's participation in construction, as well as mental health and wellbeing and why it's such a critical issue in the construction industry. Let's jump in. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thanks for the invitation.
It's great to have you here. So, Michelle, you were involved in the Culture in Construction Taskforce. Can you briefly explain what that is?
Sure. The Culture in Construction Taskforce was a group of folks set up from the Victorian and New South Wales governments, as well as members from the Australian Constructors Association and some peak bodies. And they really came together to think about how they could address the issue of low productivity in construction. There's also a massive shortage of folks in construction, so wondering where the next generation of construction workforce is going to come from, but also probably, and this is where I fit in, the very poor mental health of our construction workforce and the high rates of suicide. So they wanted to know, why is the workforce experiencing these issues and what can be done to fix these issues, to really address these issues longer term. So that's where I came in as a researcher who's done some research in the field around occupational health and wellbeing in construction.
So can you talk more then about your involvement with the task force and what you did within the task force?
So what initially happened, and it's a great thing, the task force is very much wanting to create an evidence base for creating a culture standard. So a really thorough literature review was done, looking at the factors and the characteristics in the workplace that can lead to really poor mental health for folks. And when we talk about the construction workforce, it's a pretty complex workforce. I'm sure a lot of the listeners will know that. So there's the professional folks who will either be based mainly in corporate or head offices. There's the professional folks will be located in the project office on site. Then there's also a large workforce who are actually on the site, doing the manual work. So quite a big and diverse workforce. So the literature review really looked at the different characteristics of the workforce that impact on each of these groups. So it wasn't a one-size-fits-all. So after that, they kind of pondered the literature review and the findings and came up with a draft culture standard. And the aim of the culture standard was to create a workplace that supports, nurtures and protects the workforce. I often heard the mantra is, people shouldn't come to work to be harmed. They should come to work to be protected and supported. So there's three pillars of the workforce, or three foundational aspects of the culture standard. One was wellbeing, and that's about what can we do, how can we design the workplace so our workforce has good wellbeing? How can we design the workplace so folks who are working in construction projects have time for life, so time for life outside of work? And also, how can we ensure that there's good level of diversity in construction projects with a particular focus on women in construction, because we know that, as I said, high rates of suicide in construction, high levels of mental health, and talking about it's definitely still a stigma in construction. And, I think construction still remains, I think in Australia, it's the most male-dominated industry.
Yes, yeah, it's definitely a massive issue for the industry. So I understand that what the task force did was take this cultural standard and apply it to some pilot programs. Is that correct?
That's exactly what they did. So my role, along with distinguished Professor Lingard and some other team members from RMIT University here in Melbourne, Australia, we worked with the task force who helped to nominate 5 different projects who were willing to pilot the culture standard. There was an expression of interest in these projects, put their hand up and said, we'd like to give this a go. So we had 2 projects in Victoria and 3 in New South Wales, and they varied. We had schools, we had hospitals, we had roads. So they were both building and civil, because, civil can be a little bit harder because often a live road and there's different constraints that need to occur around doing works to a road, for example. So they put up their hand, and in doing so that they agreed they will put in, an action plan of how they were going to implement those 3 pillars of wellbeing, time for life and diversity. So what we did is we worked with each of the 5, and we ran surveys and interviews at different points during the project. So we measured things like, wellbeing, managerial support for flexibility, respect and civility between folks, because there's a strong evidence base to say that there's often a lot of conflict, a lot of interpersonal conflict in construction, which can be damaging for people's mental well-being. We also measured time for life. So really those things that underpin the 3 pillars of the culture standard. And the other thing that we did, and this is as a bit of feedback, so I'm just going to take a step back and say there was 3 components of the research. The first was a cost-benefit analysis, and the task force engaged a group of economists, so frontier economists, to do a cost-benefit analysis on the 5 pilot projects. So that was one piece of research. The other piece of research was led by some other academics who are working with us, and they talked with some key decision makers in construction. So, you've got your CEOs, client leads, some leads on some of the peak bodies to say, what are your thoughts about the culture standard? Do you agree with it? What do you think some of the barriers might be? And one of the key barriers that came across was, everything's all really good when we start the project, but as we ramp into final milestones, practical completion and that kind of thing, all those go out the window, because if we don't hit our milestones, we're going to be often hit with some really serious penalties. So we thought, okay, so it'll be important to include out of those 5 projects, at least some projects that were coming to the end of the project. So we're able to follow them to the end and see what happened with these elements of the culture standard. So, for example, around time for life, it's really common that folks will work 6 out of 7 days on a construction site. That's apparently the norm, industry norm and an expectation. And it's often common that folks will work really long hours. So we've spoken to folks who work, 60, 70, 75 hours per week. And it's an expectation that they'll do that, whether they're either on site carrying out the manual works or they're in the site office, construction manager, engineer, that kind of thing. So part of the culture standard, it capped working hours at 50, and I know that's still a lot, but in the context, it's quite good. So they capped it at 50, but with an upper level of 55. And they also capped working days 5 out of 7. So here you can see the challenges. Could they maintain that as they came towards the end of delivering a hospital or a school or major infrastructure? So a lot of folks who didn't think they could. So that was actually really, really interesting. The other thing to say is that, while these three pillars might seem like they're separate, like, supporting people's wellbeing, mental wellbeing, and making sure folks have got time for life, both they do their job, but they've got time to spend with their family or their friends or sports, whatever they like to do, and also providing diversity and support for women. They're all interlinked. So another really strong component of the culture standard is we can't have one without the other. All three are required to meet the requirements of the culture standard of supporting people's wellbeing, ensure they're having time for life, and diversity. So that was my role. So we did surveys, we've done interviews, and reported back to each of the 5 pilot projects. We call them the pilot projects. So it was very iterative. I guess the great thing, the really nice thing about being a researcher was you got really immediate feedback from the pilot team. So as a researcher, we put our objective hat on and we have to report back what we find from the survey data and the interview data. And some of it's potentially challenging for those projects to hear. But I have to say I was so impressed with the leadership teams who received these reports, warts and all, and they took them seriously and came back together and said, how can we amend the way that work is structured so we can ensure that people have got wellbeing, time for life, and diversity? For example, in the earlier stages of data collection at one of the projects, folks were working 5 days a week. They were still working quite long hours, and they felt like their 6-day work week had been squeezed into 5 days. So their mental wellbeing wasn't great and they were feeling really fatigued. So we reported that back to the pilot project, who then actually amended the way that work was rostered and organised. So that was, I was so impressed by the level of maturity and willingness to try out new things to support the workforce.
So overall, the sort of outcomes from these pilot programs in terms of implementing the cultural standard, it was fairly positive?
It was really, really positive. So there was a couple of things, like everything will go pear-shaped once projects reach the end of their scheduled timeframes. They don't want to go into liquidated damages. The other thing, and I think I talked earlier about the different workforces we've got within the construction industry. We've got the salaried folks who get paid a set amount, depending, it doesn't matter how many hours they work. You talk about, your engineers, your quantity surveyors, your construction managers, all those folks, your environmental managers. And then you've got the folks who are on site. So, your scaffolders, your builders, your tilers, all those people. So they're the wage workers. Now, wage workers, they'll get paid to a certain amount, and after that, those hours, they get paid overtime. So there was a concern that if the working week is brought down to 5 days instead of 6 and hours are capped at 50, that wage workers are going to lose money, and that was going to be a disadvantage for those people, which was a concern. And so to get around that, like structurally get around that, the workers worked 5 days a week, but they worked an hour or two of overtime Monday to Friday, which gave them the overtime. So it meant that they didn't lose all that much money. I mean, some wage folks were telling us that they might have lost a couple of $100. In the scheme of things, when they got a 2-day weekend, that was brilliant. What we did see, though, consistently across the survey data, particularly, was when we surveyed the wage folks and then talked to them, there was always about 33% of wage folks who wanted more hours. They wanted more hours. And that was for a couple of reasons. One may have been cost of living. So cost of living is going up. 2 might be they're at a certain life stage where they're saving for a car, saving for a house. They've got young children. They've got a family to support. So that was quite consistent. So, but again, that was a little surprising because I think a lot of folks thought that all of the wage folks would have wanted to have longer hours, more days. But in fact, the majority of them loved the 5 days a week. A lot of them during the interviews told us this was the first time, in working for 30 years, they'd ever had 2 consecutive days off. And what they also told us, it meant that having the 2 consecutive days off, they had 1 day to rest and to recover and catch up on their sleep. And then they had another day to go and do something with their family, get involved in the child's sports, go fishing. So they came back to Monday feeling quite refreshed and energised. And while it's counterintuitive, although they were working less days and less hours, they felt personally that they were being more productive. And their supervisors through the interviews also said that there's less mistakes because people are rested, they're calmer, they've got better problem solving capability. It's making a lot of difference, and that's why we're more productive. So that was terrific.
So it really reinforced that connection between workplace culture and productivity and how there's that interrelation there.
Absolutely, that's right. And, it's important to ask the workers themselves, do you think you're more productive or not? They will know. And they said, we're all told work more hours, be more productive. But, they said, we drag ourselves to work on a Saturday. We are exhausted. Often we're annoyed that we're here. We're not very motivated. And then we get back to work on Monday and we're starting the working week already tired. And we know that if folks don't have enough time to, rest and recover, I guess the concern is burnout. And that's, very, very serious. So, if rather than starting at 100% energy on the Monday, you're staying at 80%, then the next Monday you're staying at 70% because you just can't catch up. That's a really dangerous spiral to go down. So folks should really appreciate having that time to really rest and recover. The other thing they told us, they said, when we do work the 6 days a week, the 7th day is always spent resting. We're on the couch, we're sleeping. Our partners get agitated with us because we won't do anything. Our children get agitated with us because we won't do anything with them. I'm missing out on family life. So in terms of my quality of life, it's really been effective and I'm really satisfied. And what we saw is that, again, through the interviews, is that they were more committed to the work and they were very thankful and committed and loyal to getting the job done.
And so the task force has sort of put out their findings or the outcomes from these pilot programs in its final report. What has been some of the industry reaction to the cultural standard?
They have been, I guess, in some ways relieved. And I think also too, there's now a really strong evidence base to say that if you do structure your projects around 5 days a week and cap it at 50, it's not going to cost any more. You're going to have a happier workforce, you're going to have a more productive workforce, you're going to have less turnover, and you're going to bring the project in on time. So it's really not going to have much of an impact at all. I think with the psychosocial regulations that will take effect from December in Victoria, even more impetus to think about what are the things in the workplace that are harming our people and really carefully thinking about what can be changed, structurally changed into the workforce so we can protect the mental health of our workers. And I know in other states, most other states in Australia, those regulations have already been, enacted, they're applied, but it's Victoria, they're about to come. So I think what this also does, it shows organisations and projects ways in which they can actually reorganise the way that work is conducted to ensure folks, their health is protected, they've got time for life, and there's a higher representation of women in construction. So yeah, it's been really, really good because, for a long time, my colleague Helen Lingard and I have been doing research in this. It's very clear. Evidence will show you these are the factors that harm people. It's lovely that we're now, as a research team and as an industry, mature to say, okay, we know that these are harmful for people. What can we do? How can we reorganise the workplace? And then that's what do they say? That's the gold standard for what we call a primary intervention, change the way that work's done to minimise or reduce potential harm.
Absolutely. You mentioned one of the focuses of the task force was women's participation in construction. If we can talk a little bit about that, what are some of the most significant structural or systemic barriers that prevent women from entering or staying in the construction industry?
Well, one of the big ones would be hours worked, particularly for folks who are thinking about having children or have children. That was really a big barrier. So often, if folks are working on site, they need to be there, perhaps at 6:30, 7 a.m. before childcare opens, and they might need to be there on site until 6 p.m. or 6:30, and then at that stage the childcare centre is closed. So childcare was an issue. So work hours is really important. And I think one of the elements under the Time for Life was this idea, or this very, very important idea of flexibility. So where possible, allowing or enabling folks to come in at a time that suits them or finish at a time that suits them. And I'll give you some concrete examples. So we're chatting to some women who were working on the pilot projects, and some of them got up early and did a couple of hours of work at home. They then took their child to childcare or school, for example, then went into the office and did some hours from the office, then left early in the afternoon, picked up their child from either childcare or school, and then came home and did a bit more work from home. So allowing that flexibility is really, really important. And that will certainly help women, particularly who have got the primary caregivers for children, and also perhaps elderly parents as well, or elderly relatives. So flexibility for them was really, really important. Some of the structural barriers was, I guess, discrimination and harassment. I mean, if you've worked in construction, you'll know that banter can be pretty loose sometimes and pretty disrespectful towards women. So the projects thought long and hard about what can we do to create a really, really safe and respectable environment for everybody, not just women, but everybody. And a lot of them instigated respect codes where there was zero tolerance for disrespectful behaviour or language. And that was, again, we talk about how we implement that into the culture of work. So that was around orientation, this idea of the expectation of a respectful workplace, zero tolerance for disrespectful behaviour and banter, for example. There was very clear consequences for this type of behaviour. And in one of the projects for subcontractors, that was part of their contract, that it would be expected they would behave in this way if they came onto this site. And that was very, very effective. Importantly, there was very strong buy-in and support from top managers, and folks who had experienced disrespectful language or behaviour felt very comfortable to go and report that to their manager, and there would be consequences for the person or people that had done that. So that made a huge difference for women who felt very safe at work, because women can feel unsafe at work. It made a big difference for these women feeling supported, and also structurally being brought into some more senior roles. One of the other things that does stop women from getting these roles is the informal hiring process that often occurs in construction. So it's really well known when it's got a strong evidence base that often the senior leaders or folks who are in high positions in construction will talk to their network and bring their network into a role. And this is often done outside of work. So it could be done, at the golf club, it could be done at a hotel or something like that. And often women have been excluded from those networks and those social situations. So it was to bring some more transparency and rigour into the hiring process, and that seemed to have done the job as well. It's important that women don't feel like they're put on because they're just a quota or a number. It's because they've got the skill and the capability to do that. One of our projects, our pilot projects, the project manager, project director, they were both women. So that was great to see, and great role models for women who may have been, junior and aspiring to a great career path in construction.
We definitely need more of that. Are there any disparities in how young women are encouraged or perhaps even discouraged from pursuing careers in the construction field?
We've just recently done some research in Queensland, actually, and I'll get to the other research. We did some research in Queensland, and we wanted to get the sense from tradesmen whether they believe that women who work on site experience discrimination. And so you talk to any woman, she'll say at some point in her life she has experienced discrimination and harassment because of her gender. And what was, I guess, of concern is that nearly half of, 700 plus men thought that women never experienced discrimination in the workplace. That was a concern, and that's particularly a concern because, men need to be involved. For men to help create the change that needs to occur, they need to be aware that women do in fact experience discrimination. So that's raised a challenge about how we bring men into this really important conversation because, they're our allies, they're often the power holders. They're the ones that can help. Right, so that's happening in the background. We spoke to schoolgirls, actually, who had been considering entering a trade after they finished year 12. Really interesting. and concerning at the same time. So a lot of these girls, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, had initially been interested in just kind of learning a bit more about a trade. Perhaps they had a family member, maybe a father who was a tradesperson in construction, or they had a brother that was a tradesperson. But often they were turned off taking up a trade, and there were a couple of reasons why. And it was interesting because one of the key reasons was whether parents supported that decision. A lot of parents said, no, we don't want you going to a trade. One, because it's an unsafe environment for you and we don't want you to experience that environment. Other parents said, oh, construction's a job for men, you don't belong there. So there were a couple of things going on there. In some of the STEM-based classes, like the classes where perhaps they would learn the skills, the technical skills around a trade, the boys made fun of them. Like, what are you doing in this class? You don't belong here. Construction, technical things for boys, and they kind of get laughed at and made fun of. And that really put some of the girls off. They also felt that the teacher of that class wasn't all that supportive either. Perhaps they didn't believe that the schoolgirl was up to it, so gave them a bit more attention. Then the girl started to second guess herself, well, maybe I can't do this and this is why I'm getting special attention. The other thing that some of the girls said is when some of the boys did make fun of them and they raised it with the teacher said, oh, you're making a big deal of nothing. It's not a big deal here. So they felt really silenced. I thought, oh gosh. Some of them had family members who worked in construction, and I remember one of the girls said, oh gosh, I was listening to my brother who works in construction talk about one of the women who work on the site with him, and he was really sexist towards her, and I was really concerned. And I thought, gosh, if I go on with construction, is this how I'll be treated as well? And then another of the schoolgirls said that her auntie works as a traffic controller. And this traffic controller auntie was saying, oh, gosh, gee, I cop a lot of discrimination and harassment just because I'm a woman. So not that they meant to influence these girls, they actually did. The other thing is the schoolgirls said that, we walked past a construction site and all we saw was men, and we don't want to go onto a site, perhaps we're the only woman. And that's a valid point because we know that overall there's 88% of men in construction, but for trades, there's actually 97%. So if they were going to go into a trade, they'd be very much a minority. The other thing was that, unfortunately, there's still quite a negative reputation of construction in broader society. And the girls pick up on that, but also the girls' parents pick up on that as well. It's like, no, we have all these bad reports about construction being unsafe for women. No, we don't want you going there. And finally, the television and social media, they told us, we see these ads on TV and it's all men and maybe one token woman, that speaks loudly. And the other thing is, we see TikTok and social media and all the women are traffic controllers and there's nothing else. So often they're not aware of the other occupations either. So it's quite a systematic, complex role that I think, we need to come together as, I guess, a community and tackle these one by one because they're all connected.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like there's a lot of work there to be done if we want to increase women's participation in the construction industry. So we spoke about your research that you've done, but you've also authored a book with Professor Helen Lingard on work, health and wellbeing in the construction industry. What led to you writing a book on that particular topic?
That's a good question. Helen and I have been doing research for many years now. I did my PhD under Helen, way back when, and we've continued doing work in, for example, work-life conflict. We've looked at mental health. We've looked at job security. We've looked at burnout. So all of these things and all of these work characteristics that can lead to poor mental health for folks. So in our readings, we got to see that there was a lot of brilliant literature, including books on safety and how we create a safe environment for our workers. But there was really less on protecting the health of the workers. And, a lot of professionals to say, it's OH&S, occupational health and safety. There's often a bigger emphasis on safety and, they call it a little H. There's less emphasis on the health aspect. So there's a real gap there. So we figured, we've written reports for industry, we've written literature reviews, and we've also, got papers out there. So we thought it was time to really consolidate that, to bring it together. And, we've done research on different cohorts within the construction industry, and it was important to raise awareness that we can't treat everyone the same. People have got different requirements. So we've got, for example, a chapter on young workers in construction. We've got a chapter on older workers in construction. We've got a chapter on women in construction. And so all of these groups have particular characteristics which create, mental ill health for these workers. So that's what we really wanted to consolidate the work. So I think industry had a nice book that they could go to and then move through. And where we could, we included case studies. So this is the problem, but this is a potential solution to overcome that problem. We also really, what do we do? So we were very, very keen to position the book in terms of a systems approach, much like I just spoke about the women. So the different elements of different systems. We talked about, the different levels of the system that all interact together and create this workplace that can harm our workforce. And we talked about the 3 levels of interventions, and we talked about, these primary interventions where we really focus on changing the work environment, as I mentioned before, to either reduce or remove the risk factor. Then there's the secondary that's really around giving folks the coping skills. And then there's tertiary where we look after the injured. So we really try to focus on the primary intervention side, which took the focus of making it the individual's problem to cope, to be resilient, to be well, and said, well, actually, it's not the individual's responsibility, it's the workplace responsibility, again, to create a workplace that doesn't harm our people.
Absolutely. So what then does a mentally healthy construction industry look like?
I think, if listeners are keen to learn more about that, there's some terrific resources around the regulations around psychosocial harm. They list about 9 or 10 characteristics of workplace that can create harm for people. I won't go through all of them, but one is, for example, if people are lacking workplace control and autonomy or decision making, that can impact on their mental health. So how do we create a workplace that people do have a say in how they work, when they work, and that kind of thing? And that talks nicely to the culture standard where people had the flexibility, for example, to come and go that suited their lifestyle, but they still got the job done. The other thing, another one of those factors was work demands. So we know for example, in construction, work demands really long work hours, high work intensity. So people say, we get to work from the minute we start work, we're on, the work intensity is, it doesn't let up. So that can lead to poor mental well-being.
And also I imagine physical injury as well. If you're on site working these long hours, you're tired, you're burnt out, I imagine there's a correlation between that and physical injury on site as well.
Absolutely. And that's a really under-researched area, and we've just touched the surface. We did some research a couple of years ago, wanted to get a better understanding of folks who are working, in direct construction activity, if they're experiencing pain, how it impacts their mental health. And it was very, very clear, sadly, that folks who are experiencing physical pain also then experience poor mental health. And of concern was folks, in their 20s were experiencing pain, weekly or if not daily, at a young age. At the other extreme, folks that had been in the construction workforce for 30, 40 years, their bodies were really broken. They felt like every day was, really, really hard. They struggled, but they also felt that they didn't have the skills to do anything else. So they felt trapped. But we also know that these workers often do retire early because their bodies just break down. So I think that's, we need to give some more thought to how we potentially redesign some of these physical jobs and also support workers, in mental health and pain. It goes hand in hand. It's tough. Yeah, so that's another challenge. But I think, some great things happening, with technology and AI that could potentially lessen the manual load for some of these workers. which means that they can perhaps, live pain-free and have a really, a longer career.
Thank you, Michelle. That was such an interesting discussion, learning more about the culture standard and your research. So thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks again for having me. I really appreciated the time with you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Building Tomorrow, the Society of Construction Law Australia podcast.
The Society of Construction Law Australia is a national organisation of members at all stages of their professional career with a shared interest in construction law.
For more info about the Society of Construction Law Australia, head to the website scl.org.au. This show was produced with strategy and production support from Sound Cartel.
To make sure you don't miss an episode of Building Tomorrow, be sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your podcast app.
And while you're there, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others find the show. I'm Mawuna Matanda.
I'm Vijay Lamsal.
And I'm Jennifer Raphael. And we'll see you in the next episode of Building Tomorrow.